Wii Music is the worst game ever made. Now, on the surface, that may sound a little harsh. Obviously, Wii Music isn't the most riveting experience out there, but there are games like Superman 64 and E.T. for the Atari, which essentially renders this statement as completely false. I mean, there's no way Wii Music is somehow worse than the widely conceived worst games of all time, right? For example, let's say you're scrolling on YouTube and you begin to notice that a bunch of YouTubers are all collectively hating on one game in particular. Superman 64. Now, on one hand, you're probably thinking something along the lines of, well, I mean, it's gotta be one of the worst games ever made, which is a completely valid assumption to make, you know, considering all these well-known YouTubers are tearing it to shreds. But somewhere in the inner machinations of your mind, you're racking your brain trying to figure out why any YouTuber would ever want to make a video about a game so objectively terrible. And then it clicks. People don't play these games with the intention of liking them, they play these games knowing they're bad. To them, it's obviously not about the quality of the game itself, but more so the novelty of simply being able to play it. Like, if I went into a shop and saw a copy of Bubsy 3D for sale, I know for a fact I'm not walking out of there empty-handed. But if I went into a shop and saw a copy of Wii Music for sale, I probably wouldn't even look at it. Basically, what I'm trying to get across here is games like Superman 64 and E.T. for the Atari are best compared to movies like Sharknado. They're not good by any stretch of the imagination, but there's at the very least some form of entertainment to be had here. Now, real quick, before I talk about the game itself, I asked ChatGPT what a game was fundamentally, and it replied with this. Fundamentally, a game is a structured activity or form of play, typically undertaken for enjoyment, entertainment, or education. Games usually involve one or more players who engage in a defined set of rules, objectives, challenges, or interactions to achieve a goal or outcome. Now, you definitely already knew all that, but I just want you to keep that definition in mind as we take the plunge into the worst game ever made. Booting it up, you're greeted with a fairly long tutorial, which, despite the terrible order of instruments, considering you have to plug in your nunchuck for the piano and the guitar, and then unplug the nunchuck for the trumpet, and then plug it back in again for the violin. But despite that, I feel as though the tutorial could have been cut short by around about 10 minutes. Now, after wrapping up the tutorial, you may or may not be surprised to hear that this game doesn't really have a lot to offer in terms of its content. First and foremost is the lessons mode, which is just about as boring as the name implies. You sit there and swing your Wii remote around like a maniac and pray to God that whatever audible garbage you churn out is good enough to please Sebastian. There is kind of an upside to completing these tutorials, since you're constantly unlocking new music, but the majority of the tracks here are just classical garbage. Don't get me wrong, there are a couple pop songs sprinkled around here and there, like Material Girl and Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, but you can tell just from looking at this list here that the bad songs definitely outweigh the good ones. So yeah, for a game completely centered around music, it really doesn't have a lot of good music. One of the only somewhat decent things you can do in this game is preview every single instrument and give them kind of a quick test run. These come alongside brief descriptions covering each instrument's backstory, even though I don't consider all of them canon. But yeah, especially compared to everything else in this game, this is probably the best feature, which isn't really saying a whole lot. Alright, with all that out of the way, now we're getting into the meat of the game, the jam sessions. This bit is the real deal, so you better be paying attention. The jam sessions are supposed to be the best part about the game, but they just end up feeling like a massive, unfinished waste of time. You pick your instrument, which isn't even that big of a choice, considering they all effectively serve the exact same purpose. After that, you pick your stage, and my jaw hit the floor when I found out that there were only 9 of these in the entire game. As for the gameplay, this is about as exciting as it gets, so just bask in it. It's just violently shaking your Wii remote or vigorously pressing buttons or whatever the hell you have to do, but in kind of a rhythm game format. But the entire game is basically ruined by one simple thing: the Wii remote. The Wii remote in this game is either way too responsive or not responsive at all. You'll barely move the Wii remote at all, and it'll somehow count as a note. You'll swing the Wii remote as intended, and it'll somehow count as 2. Or worst of all, you'll swing the Wii remote, and it'll count as nothing. So when it comes to this game, the controller pretty much decides your fate. And even if you somehow manage to perfectly bang out a song note for note, it'll still sound really off, mainly because the notes in this game aren't fully fleshed out. You'll strum the guitar guitar, and instead of it making a normal guitar noise, it'll make a really short and irritating sound, which kind of resembles a guitar, and you'll just be sat there wondering why you even chose to pick up this game to begin with. If you manage to get through a whole song, you can then save it as a music video. This not only means you can view your performances whenever you want, but you can also make a bomb-ass album cover. Alright, maybe you can't make a bomb-ass album cover, considering the features here are really limited, but you can definitely make, you know, an album cover, for whatever that's worth. And the final thing to talk about here are the mini-games. And I mean, look, I'm all for educational games and all, but was there any reason to make the games this boring? Me Maestro might be the best out of them all, but that's not really saying much, considering it's not really that interactive. Handbell Harmony is way too easy for its own good, and Pitch Perfect is just a collection of uninspired educational dross. And circling back to the definition I mentioned earlier, fundamentally, video games are supposed to be a form of, quote, entertaining play. And since we've already clarified that there is some entertainment value in games like Superman 64 and E.T. for the Atari, there are things to make fun of, there are things to poke fun at, but when it comes to a game as bare bones and dry as Wii Music, it is so challenging to fight the urge to jump out of your goddamn window. There's nothing to talk about here, there's nothing to play, there isn't even anything to make fun of, because it's all so boring. At least with a really bad game you can say, wow, this game sucks, and then laugh about it for a good half an hour. But with Wii Music, the more appropriate reaction would be, wow, this game sucks. So yeah, sorry that this video was a bit all over the place. I kind of booted up Wii Music and then instinctively panicked at how terrible it was. Thanks for watching. If you want, you can subscribe because it'll really help me out a lot. And the great thing about having under 1,000 subscribers is that with every new subscriber, that number changes. If you subscribe, that number goes up. If you don't subscribe, then, you know, but then it doesn't. Anyway, I hope you have a good whatever the hell you're doing, or whatever the hell you plan to do. And with that being said, thank you for watching. I don't think it went fully down.